Tine Vertomme is from Belgium, Flemish. Yeah, it's a difference. Huh? Thomas More University of Applied Sciences. That's then again an English name. But recently she's also appointed at the IOC in the Safe Sports Unit. So we're moving from the extreme athlete to the female athlete to harassment and abuse in sports, all athletes.
Merci. Two of my teammates grabbed me in the shower. They said it was just for fun. He said I was special. As long as I did exactly as he said, I would make it to the next Olympics. She's just like that, they said. It's just her way of coaching. The fear will make me compete better. I kept it a secret for so many years. How could I? Maybe I was ashamed. Maybe I doubted whether it would truly happen to me. I fell off the beam and I felt a crack in my back. She screamed at me to finish my routine. The doctor found a stress fracture in my lower back. I was so scared. He said he would jump off a bridge if I ever told somebody. This one, I'm gonna let you read it yourself. He was the most popular guy in the club. I had no proof. No one would ever believe me. Everybody in the gym saw what happened there. Nobody did something. I was so confused. Welcome to my short presentation. I'm going to talk about something that maybe is as uncomfortable as Kirsty just introduced and discussed with us. Harassment and abuse in sport. It's no longer a secret that it happens. And I'm very happy today to be here. Thanks for the invitation and to be part of a sports medical conference, because indeed this is a medical issue. And I think we should all be ready to discuss it, and after today also know what to do. That's why I'm going to talk to you about detection, but also, of course, response to harassment and abuse. First, I'm going to talk to you a little bit through what it is, what I think it is, who is it for, and then, of course, why I think we should do something about it, and how, of course, the last part, how we can do it, and what you from today on can do to help prevent it. Now, this is us all together doing sport. This is how I look, and probably when you think about sport, you think about this. This is what I see. These are what the numbers of our studies show. 3 out of 4 athletes reports at least one negative experience regarding harassment or abuse in sport before the age of 18. That's a lot. Okay, luckily not all these experiences are considered as moderate or severe, but still 1 in 10 reports serious incidents that we can classify as severe harassment and abuse. That means that in the teams that you are supervising, and in this room of athletes and people at home, there are people with severe experience of abuse in or outside sport. This is pretty serious, pretty high number. There are a lot of myths about harassment and abuse in general society and also in sport. Often people think elite athletes, they have a professional entourage, they are at the highest performance, they're super resilient, they are at lower risk for experiencing harassment and abuse. That's a myth, unfortunately. The coach is most often the perpetrator. If we read the newspapers and look at the documentaries, yes, he's the most common reported perpetrator. That's not the case. Peer athletes are most often reported as the perpetrators of harassment and abuse towards young athletes. Adult men, they cannot experience harassment and abuse. With the Me Too movement, it's all about women and girls that need to be protected. It's not true. They report the same levels compared to females. Girls do not commit harassment and abuse. That's not true either. Girls do, mostly psychological forms of harassment and abuse. It happens once, and then it stops. Unfortunately, that's the biggest myth there is. If we ask people who experience harassment and abuse, most of them say it happened twice or even several times too regularly and often. It doesn't happen once, it's in the system, it's in the culture. Most of us are exposed to several incidents of harassment and abuse. Athletes rarely report harassment and abuse within their sport organizations. Unfortunately, that's a fact. We don't know that much because we don't speak about it, and it's very hard for people who experience it to really talk about it. These are some recent studies that I pulled together to look at what is now the prevalence of harassment and abuse in sport. It's hard to study this problem, and as you know, it's quite a relatively new topic in science. So just a couple of studies with a varying methodology and also with varying numbers, but these are the lowest estimates I could find. They say up to 7 out of 10 athletes experience neglect in sport before the age of 18. 60% experience psychological violence, or at least one type of psychological violence. Luckily, a lower number, but still pretty high, is found for physical and sexual violence in sport, up to 1 in 6, 1 in 7 athletes. Now, it happens at all competition levels, so not only in elite sport, not only in recreational sport. We did find a correlation with the competition level and the training load. Athletes that compete and train more than 16 hours a week report higher levels of harassment and abuse of all types. It also happens to boys and girls, that's what studies showed. While sexual harassment has been traditionally more reported by female athletes, in anonymous self-reports we find the same levels for men and women, boys and girls. It happens in all sports, in all continents. There is not one study that shows that a certain type of violence is higher in one country or in one specific sport. So it seems to be universal and doesn't make any change when you go from country to country. Although, of course, we do lack studies from certain regions in the world just yet. What we also find is that para-athletes and athletes from the LGBTQI community report higher levels of psychological violence and sexual violence. Not all studies find that, but most do. Why do we know so little? Well, I'm a criminologist, by the way, and this is an important slide to me. It explains to you the dark figure. This is a criminological concept where you see that there's a big shift and change between the actual reality of what happens and the number, so the highest stop there, of convictions. If we look at it from a criminological point of view, of course, the most honest way to look at crime and offenses is to look at the number of convictions, because after conviction we know truth has been found and we know these are actual cases of established and investigated offenses. Of course, if this is not working, is it annoying for you? Oh, it is for me, but that's fine. So, if you really want to have an idea of the total reality of experiences, don't look at the top only. We know there's a very big threshold for people to report, then for cases to be investigated, and for convictions to follow. That means that the top of the iceberg there is not only very small, it's also totally not representative for what's beneath the surface. What do we do then as scientists? We try to go as close as possible to the actual experiences. And that's why we focus on anonymous self-reports in studies. We do that because there we think we can provide safety, anonymity for people to really honestly report about harassment and abuse experiences, and also because we know many of them will never disclose in another way. Look at this number. There's really very, very little people that report experience of harassment and abuse in sport, and if they do, they don't like to do it in the sports club or in the sport organization. They prefer to do it, to tell it to somebody in their close environment, maybe a parent or a friend, somebody at school. They don't want to risk disclosing it in the context of sport because they feel ashamed, they fear the consequences, they just don't know where to go. What is harassment and abuse? That is actually 90% of the time I'm spending in research, that is my main question. What I think is harassment and abuse is that the same to you. And what about your neighbor? And what about translating it in another language? We use, for example, in Flemish, we love to say the word grensoverschrijdend gedrag. And I think the Dutch now like it too. Boundary transgressive behavior, really, it doesn't make sense in another language just yet. These are just, in English, some words that I found that we often use to describe this type of unwanted, unhealthy, unacceptable behaviors in sport. Interpersonal violence, assault, abuse, harassment, all these kind of terms. So let's try to be clear on this. What does it mean? Well, looking at the WHO definition of violence, which is an umbrella term for all these types of harassment and abuse, we see that they link it into self-directed violence, interpersonal violence, and collective violence, 3 types, and always with 4 different types and natures of the violence: physical, sexual, psychological, and neglect. Often neglected is a topic of neglect, also in sport. If we look at the context of sport, of course, we focus now, and these are also the data that I showed, on community violence. So violence from one person to another, not to your whole community. And that person could be somebody known to the athlete or unknown to the athlete. Think about spectators in a stadium, for example, that commit verbal abuse to a certain player. If we look at the athletes themselves, of course, the violence could be directed from different angles. It could be from the coach, indeed. It could be from the entourage or even the parents in the context of sport. Don't forget the pushy parents. But it mainly comes from peer athletes. Certainly in team sport, the peer dynamic is super important and lots of bullying behaviors exist then between peers and not from the coach towards the athletes. Something we often forget if we see or believe the newspaper articles. Now, what types of behaviors is it then? We of course know child sexual abuse, violence towards children. We know that from outside sport. But how does it translate in sport? What do we see there? These are all behaviors or experiences that we found in our studies. And if you look at them, and of course we use a factor analysis to see which factors can we find here, we find a couple interesting. First of all, often experienced together are forms of physical violence, like you can see here, being shaken, being pushed, being grabbed, objects being thrown at you, being hit by hand, punched, kicked, choked or strangled, very clear examples of physical violence. These are also very clear, a very big group of experience that we could call psychological violence or neglect, such as being threatened, being insulted or humiliated, being rejected, being ignored on purpose, or being neglected. Then, of course, the obvious sexual experiences are very similar to the outside sport context. Sexual remarks, unwanted sexual attention, being watched while you're undressed, your privacy being invaded, and of course, to sexual assault and even rape. Now, in a very recent study, we found an extra factor. So instead of the obvious three, we found a new factor in our data analysis. Well, I didn't find it, the data itself showed it in a factor analysis. And these were items that were very interesting because you don't see them that much outside sport. We don't know that category from outside sport. Forced to injure, an athlete that's been forced to injure an opponent. An athlete that's been asked or forced to limit social life, stop school, not see friends and family anymore. An athlete that's being forced to additional training while he already feels exhausted, injured, super tired. An athlete that is forced to do exercises that are too difficult or too dangerous for the level that he or she is at the moment. An athlete that is forced to go on a forced diet. An athlete that is being forced to play while injured or sick. And of course, an athlete that's being forced into doping use. These are specific forms of violence, as you can see, with a physical and or psychological component. For now, we've called this factor instrumental violence. And we see a very strong correlation with competition level. So the higher you are on the competition ladder, the more experience you report with this type of instrumental violence. And this is, I think, where we can make a big difference. This is actually the current discussion in a debate about physical health, psychological health, and well-being in athletes. What about this instrumental violence? Now, why is this important and why am I so happy to be here today? It's because of the links, the missing links that we've not been speaking about. We all know injury and illness, and I think the consequences for mental health on illness and the other way around. There's people in the room here, Vincent, that know better than I do, that of course there is a relationship between the two. If you have mental health problems, it can influence injury and illness, and we pretty know very well now that having an injury might also affect the mental health of the athletes, certainly if you talk about elite athletes. Well, it's the same for harassment and abuse. Of course, experiencing harassment and abuse can have long and short-term negative consequences on mental health. The other way around, athletes that are not mentally fit are much more conducive to experience harassment and abuse. Let's not forget that. And the same, while we do lack solid evidence base there, I think the same is true for harassment and abuse towards injury and illness prevention. Of course, experiencing harassment and abuse makes you more vulnerable for physical abuse. And physical violence, of course, and of course that may lead to injury and illness, the other way around, illness and injury. If you are injured, many of these athletes are very eager to return to play and then more easily let let other people cross their own personal boundaries and their own personal integrity on a physical or psychological level. So it's important to add this in a discussion. We know it's a super prevalent problem, so if you are diagnosing your athlete, if you're doing a risk assessment of how is the athlete doing, this is one piece of the puzzle that has been missing so far, and we need to improve on that. If we install a safeguarding culture, I can promise you that the raising awareness will help the athlete. It will give voice to people that didn't feel acknowledged for this problem before. It will help them to find their voice. It will also then lower the threshold for reporting or even just speaking about what happened to you. It will allow us to intervene sooner. As we know from research, it happens multiple times. It doesn't start straight away with rape. It often increases in severity and in frequency. So if we can detect it earlier, of course we can intervene earlier. And this all to create an athlete-centered environment where athletes' health is being understood in a very broad sense. If we are able to do that in a successful way, I'm pretty sure sport will be safer, but also much more fun. Think about the dropout rates, specifically in young girls leaving competitive or organized sport. If we can make it more safe, it will be more fun. And I strongly believe that if your athlete is healthy and safe, he will also perform better. And that's our goal, right? If we think about competition sport. Now, let's just talk briefly how we can do that, and then this problem is solved. Safeguarding, another word that we don't know how to translate. Personally, into Dutch, I don't know what it means. I do understand very well what it means in English, and I like the word because it's super broad. I think we can put everything under there that we can do to improve the athlete's health and well-being. It's both prevention as well as response. So everything you do as an organization to prevent and respond to concerns related to harassment and abuse. It's broader than, for example, child protection or athlete protection, which is where you go into specific risk in specific target group of athletes to make sure that that risk doesn't lead to harassment and abuse. This is a more positive approach, focusing globally on athlete well-being. Now, whose responsibility? We got that question before to you, Kirsty. Well, I know the answer. Everybody's. Everybody's responsibility. It's not only the coach that needs to do that. It's not only the club board. They cannot only do that. It's all of us being close to the athlete or a little bit further away, from the club level to the federation level to even the international level. And that's why I'm here today, because also the IOC is now strongly investing in safeguarding approaches and policies towards all athletes. Of course, first of all at the Games, but secondly also wider in the Olympic movement. How do you do that? Well, we don't have to invent the wheel. Harassment and abuse is a big problem, even also outside sport. So if you go to the public health approach, we know what to do, which steps to follow. First, define a problem, then try to measure the prevalence or the magnitude of the problem, think about specific risk and protective factors. I think this is where, like step 3, this is where our research now is at, and then invent or develop interventions. If you can do it evidence-based, if you lack the evidence-based still, don't wait, and just start what you think that might work and then collect the data while you're doing. This is too urgent to wait for randomized controlled trials. It's so difficult in this area, so please start doing something. There are examples outside sport. Try to translate them into the context of sport. Do more than just code of conduct, really. I heard somebody say at UNICEF, a code of conduct only protects a child from the rain if you keep it above their head. It should be implemented. It should be not on the shelf. It should be in practice. People should know what it means. People should know where to find it. People should understand what's in there and what the consequences are if you then transgress one of these rules in the code. But there's more. There's much more than just a code of conduct. I think you all know these pictures. There are exercises to prevent injuries. Fantastic. What if we had that to prevent harassment and abuse? Well, I think we do have. We have indeed these codes of conduct. We have safer recruitment strategies. How to make sure that people that come into sport are screened for example, previous criminal offenses. It's quite easy, and in the Netherlands they have a good example of already doing that. What if we have safeguarding officers? Another role on top of the menstrual coaches, but safeguarding officers, I think, in all major sport organizations, we're now in a transition where there's somebody appointed, trained, supervised and support to do this kind of job. Because if you can imagine, it's quite a tough job to have. Most of all, education. That's why, of course, I'm also here today. We need to educate all stakeholders in sport. What is it? How to speak about it? What do you understand that it means? Where is the athlete voice? What does the athlete understand themselves? What do they think is important? How they want to have their rights protected? Risk assessment of your organization, so not only at the interpersonal level, but also at the organization level. And of course, you need to have procedures in place when something then did go wrong, how to handle that outside sport in the criminal system, but also inside sport, a disciplinary procedure. All of that we can place on this beautiful map. Don't only look at response or reaction mechanisms. That's too late. That's only 3% of what's really going out there. Invest everything you can in education and prevention, and even more in general quality policy. How safe is my infrastructure? Do I listen to the athlete voice? What about the democratic styles in my sport environment? What's the role of the sport physician in there? Is there a safeguarding protocol? How does that work in my organization? So think about it from a very broad perspective and do not only focus on the coach-athlete relationship. There's so much more. You see that Amy told us about the big team that she has. Everybody has a role to play there. Everybody also has a personal relationship with the athletes, which is a benefit, but of course also a risk that we should try to control. Now, if you implement all of these different safeguarding strategies, you still, of course, will have some mazes here, like in the Swiss cheese model. So try to make them as small as you can. Because always there will be kind of a risk that cannot be 100% managed or guarantee that it will not happen. There will always be some holes, and we need to find them, make them smaller if possible. We need to make sure they're not there anymore. And that's why we need a system with all these measures in place. Let me conclude with your personal role, if I can be so free to give you some advice on what to do. First of all, and that's, I think, the topic of this morning, be ready. Be ready to listen, communicate with your athletes. And communication always starts by listening. So be very vigilant for signs. Sometimes an athlete tells you something, but most of the time they will not tell you, but you will see it. If you really pay attention, if you listen carefully, if you look at their behavior, take time. Take time with the athletes, be present, recognize signs. And for you to recognize the signs, you need to know what they are. Since harassment and abuse is a very diverse topic, they could be very different. From very extreme, visible signs like unwanted pregnancy or bruises you cannot explain, to less visible things like changing in behaviors, changing in sleeping pattern, changing menstrual cycle, things that you think, okay, there's stress, I cannot explain where it comes from, or there's an injury I cannot explain, it keeps returning. Think one step further. So often this could be, of course, at the origin of what the problem is. Then, of course, if you think something might be off, because that's the feeling. In Dutch, they say, niet pluis. Something is off. You feel something is not there. Don't wait. Don't think it's not my business. The coach needs to say, or the parents will take care of it, or maybe I'm not sure. I didn't see it properly. I'm too far away from the athlete. Don't do that. Don't be shy to do something. If you can't take a direct action, always make sure to keep some notes and try to find a colleague or somebody else in the team that you can talk to. It's so important to do something and not nothing. Listen very actively, keep on listening and monitor the situation. And as soon as you think, okay, I know how to describe something, go to your colleague and just ask them, what do you think about these athletes? Do you feel the same? I saw this last week. Did you have the same observation? And then try to come up with a plan, of course. Not doing anything is always the bad choice. And it always, of course, protects the perpetrator and not the athletes. Then don't do this alone. It's complex. It's sensitive. It takes a lot of energy from you. It can make you feel uncomfortable, scared, and it also has an impact on several people in the environment of the athlete. So try to find team members. Make sure in your organization where you work that you know where to go to. The clubs or the sport organization where you work in, do they have a safeguarding officer? Is there a policy? If not, ask for it. Ask the president, ask people in the medical commission or whatever you can find. So where is it? What can I do? Where can I find help? And of course, if it's serious, do report. It doesn't stop at a clinical intervention. There's more to do. We need to make sure there's no relapse. We need to make sure that the long-term impact are monitored. So it doesn't stop at the clinical, personal level. Sometimes official report is necessary. Go via your sport federation. Make sure where to find it. That's something you can do today. In your country where you are, what is the helpline number in case there is an emergency? When can I call them? Is there a chat line available for the athletes? What can I offer to the athlete? Because sooner or later, everybody here will be confronted with a case. Directly or indirectly, an athlete will disclose something. And this is where I don't want to stop there, but that's the most important message. Although I could not finish without showing you this new paper in a British Journal for Sports Medicine. We talk about athletes' health a lot, and I think there's a right to do so, and I think it's very important. But let's not forget everybody that works in sport. It's not all about the athletes. Athletes also commit violence against other people in the sports context. And this study, I was quite shocked to read this. Of course, there is also gender bias there, and of course, people, for example, sport doctors, experience harassment and abuse themselves. And the numbers, I believe, are very high. In this study, it was found that 80% of the female sports medicine physicians report to be harassed by male athletes. So from the male athlete towards the female doctor. 12% by other people in the sport administration, and 30% by male physicians with a higher seniority grade. 30%, that's 1 in 3 doctors, they say they have been harassed by a male older colleague, versus only 1 to 2% of the male participants in this study. So don't stop by looking at the athlete only, look in your environment. Be receptive for this. There might be colleagues of yours that are struggling or that experienced something in the past or maybe outside sport and bring that traumatic experience into their job today. Athletes need to be protected, but athletes also need to comply with rules and show respect not only to each other but also to the professional staff. So please be mindful of that and start working on this today. I think we are all bystanders, and we have here an excellent opportunity to do a good thing just by listening and being more attentive to this kind of symptoms. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tina. And it's really powerful, those quotes you put in the beginning. It immediately lets you know that there's more than we actually know about this. I do think we have time for a question, if there is any. They're all in the back seats.
Thanks. Thank you for your very nice presentation and also for encouraging us to take our responsibility with the nice steps in our role. I think it's very nice. I was having a question about the new factor you found, because it also says that if the people are getting pushed in their exercises and then when they are exhausted and they need to keep going, I believe the line is very thin over there, and also experience by every athlete might be different in there. Red Bull even uses keep pushing as a hashtag. So I was wondering what your opinion is about that, and how to handle that as a sport medicine physician or as a physiotherapist.
I think Amy already answered that question in my opinion about what does the athlete want. And sometimes that's difficult. I agree there with Gino. Sometimes they ask, but what do you think I should do? And then try to engage them in decision making. Not make it being pushed by the coach at that same moment to do more and don't go out of the pool and keep on pushing and you're not tired yet. That is a decision that is then made at a moment that's very difficult to intervene. But we see more and more in higher competition sport that there is a decision team around the athlete, that the coach is being supported by medical and paramedical staff. That really helps. And I would try to argue that the athlete, of course, is a very important voice around that table. And keep pushing. I hope that refers to the athlete that is asked to keep pushing their own boundaries with consent of the athlete and with support of his environment. What do you want to achieve? And we will help you push your own boundaries. By including the athletes in the decision, they can decide themselves pretty well how far they can go. An athlete that feels like in the quote I used, I heard something cracking my back, take that seriously. That's a very clear sign. Ask your athletes how you're doing. What's your menstrual cycle? How are you feeling today? How rested are you? Are you ready to keep going? How do you want me to encourage you during practice? Sometimes athletes want tough encouragement. They want you to be harsh. Try to communicate with your athlete before. One athlete might be very different from the other. So as soon as they are reflective of that style, it is possible for you to have a conversation. I recommend to do that at the beginning of every season. How do you want me to coach you? How do you want me to support you with your injuries, with your recovery time? Make them part of that discussion. More easy said than done, certainly when you talk about children. And there something else comes into play. You are a caregiver at that time, you're responsible for a child's health when they are below the age of 18. Be very serious about that. Consent of a child is something else. Officially, from a criminological point of view, you need consent of the parents. And that's where it gets tough. And my advice there to coaches is, if 9 out of 10 of your athletes likes the way that you touch their ponytails when you explain something during the timeout, but one is not comfortable, why would you do it? If you don't need it to be effective as a coach, and I don't think you need, then why would you do it? So take one more careful step before you're doing it. And if you are pushing, make sure athletes know why you do it and inform them and make them part of that decision. Have a discussion about it. It shouldn't be hard. It shouldn't be very severe. Or it should just, what's your style? This is my style. What does it mean? And make sure they do know where to go in case something is off. Realize that for you as a doctor or as a physician or as a coach, you might be too high or too far away or too dangerous to talk to. So always inform your athletes if something is off, if you want to speak about something. If something happened at training that you didn't like, feel free to go to safeguarding officer, welfare officer, menstrual coach, or whatever person that is around that the athlete feels more close to where there's a lower threshold. And then you can install some kind of a safety net to make sure that goes well. Thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you very much.